My name is Congressman Alan Lowenthal. I want to begin the virtual forum that we're having on reclaiming oil and gas wells, creating jobs, and protecting the environment by cleaning up and plugging wells on the Energy and Minerals Resources Subcommittee. This is a virtual forum. I want to preface my comments by saying I am disappointed that we're not holding a subcommittee hearing. I try to run these subcommittee hearings in a bipartisan manner, and I'm going to miss the input of my Republican colleagues. These are all very unusual times, and not only with the COVID-19 pandemic, but I'd like to say that last night in my town of Long Beach, we had thousands of people doing a peaceful demonstration, exercising their rights to free speech until after we had the curfew, and then a small group of people began rioting, and there was some burning and looting that took place in Long Beach. I just want to compliment the government, the mayor, the police department for being very, very patient and supportive, and I don't want to lose sight that they were really there, the people, to demonstrate against what they perceived was racial prejudice and what had taken place in Minneapolis, and the looting did not really mar from the feeling from the community that came together in a peaceful protest. Today's hearing, though, we're going to hear from experts and stakeholders about reclaiming orphan wells and orphan oil and gas wells, and how plugging these wells and cleaning up these sites can create jobs and also protect the environment. As this subcommittee has discussed at length, oil and gas development has broad environmental and public health impacts. And those impacts don't just disappear when these wells are no longer being used. That's why we require companies to plug wells when they're done with them, and to reclaim the surrounding land to their original condition. This helps to restore the land. It provides better wildlife habitat. It protects against groundwater contamination and methane leaks. In addition to being a powerful greenhouse gas, methane leaks from improperly abandoned wells can cause local air pollution problems and can even lead to explosions. Unfortunately, the reclamation of obsolete oil and gas wells doesn't always happen as it should, because often that company that owns the well has gone bankrupt. The wells they leave behind are called orphan wells, and ideally the company left behind a bond or other forms of financial assurance that would pay to clean them up. But these bonds don't exist or aren't nearly enough. In these situations, taxpayers are on the hook to cover the reclamation costs. According to the Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission, there are at least 56,000 known orphan wells in the United States, spread across public, state, and private land. In my own state, in January, California reported that there are over 5,500 wells in the state that are orphaned or at high risk of becoming orphaned. And they estimated the potential cleanup cost is around $500 million. But the state only holds bonds that are worth about $26 million. As we all can see, that is a huge gap. When it comes to public land, part of the problem is that the minimum BLM bond amounts have not increased since 1960, which is why last year I introduced HR 4346, a bill to increase the minimum bond amounts and require regular adjustments for inflation. But while reforming bonding is necessary, if we want to prevent new orphan wells, it will not address the tens of thousands of existing orphan wells that are currently leaking contaminants and posing a great risk to local communities. So now we see the double whammy of an international oil price war and a COVID-19 pandemic, which means that we could be looking at huge numbers of oil and gas companies going bankrupt in the coming months, leaving behind more orphan wells and costing a lot of workers their job. But at the same time, this is going to provide us a great opportunity. Congress can create a program to properly plug and reclaim these orphan wells, and in the process, create thousands of jobs for unemployed oil and gas workers. It's a win for the environment, it's a win for states, it's a win for workers, and it simply accelerates the cleanup that American taxpayers are on the hook for sooner or later anyway. I still believe we need to fix the rules that created these orphan wells in the first place. But our first priority needs to be getting out of this crisis and putting people back to work. I would like to reiterate what I said before at the beginning. Democrats and Republicans must work together to advance solutions. With that, I want to thank our panelists for participating in today's forum, and I look forward to having a meaningful discussion. Now I'm going to introduce our panelists. Our first panelist is Lynn Helms. Lynn is the director of the North Dakota Department of Mineral Resources. Mr. Helms is presently acting today on behalf of the Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission. Our second panelist is Adrian Sandoval. Adrian is the Oil Conservation Division Director for the New Mexico Energy, Mineral, and Natural Resources Department. Our third panelist is Daniel Rainey, who is the Senior Research Associate at Resources for the Future. And our fourth panelist is Sarah Kendall, who is the Program Director for the Western Organization of Resources Councils, or WORC. Mr. Helms, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for those introductory remarks. I have to say that the Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission would agree with everything you had to say. I am, as you said, the director of North Dakota's Department of Mineral Resources, and our governor, Doug Burgum, is currently the chair of the Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission, and I am appearing on behalf of the Compact Commission. It's commonly known as IOGCC. It's a multi-state government entity made up of the governors of 31 member states and 7 associate states. The entity is designed to work on common issues that we find in the regulation of oil and gas drilling and production. We pool our collective knowledge to champion conservation and efficient recovery of domestic oil and natural gas while protecting health, safety, and the environment. 31 states, as I said, are full members, 7 are associate members. And in addition to our member states, we work with several federal agencies and international affiliates. So this year, IOGCC published an updated report on state regulatory strategies for idle and orphan wells. We collected information from the states on the number, the universe of drilled and idle and orphan wells in each state, as well as a lot of work on the different types of financial assurance and plugging funds that are used by states and provinces to try to mitigate the problem. Orphan wells are idle wells that, as you said, for which there's no operator, or else the operator is unknown or insolvent. The responsibility for monitoring those wells and plugging them falls on the states. We found that the states have documented almost 56,600 orphan wells across the country, with an estimate of at least 210,000 undocumented or recently orphaned wells as a result of the COVID crisis. Most of the undocumented wells are pre-regulatory. They were drilled to shallow depths, and they may not be the same risk as the documented orphan wells. IOGCC has identified this as a category of wells that need further work, and we want to work with the Department of Energy with regards to that. We also looked at the cost to plug orphan wells. The total varies a lot by state and even within a state. For example, Indiana spends about $9,000 per well, while Utah spends about $88,000. And the national average to plug an orphan well is $18,940. There's a lot of factors that account for the variation, but the number one factor is how deep the well is, and the number two is where it's located. For example, in my state, North Dakota, wells can be drilled to 27,000 feet measured depth. So each well can cost $75,000 to simply plug it, another $75,000 to reclaim it. States use a lot of financial assurance methods and other mechanisms like plugging funds to fund well plugging activities, but the available resources don't allow for the plugging of the huge inventory that we have. For example, in North Dakota, due to the COVID crisis, we've gone from 0 to 366 orphan wells in just 2 months. So why is it important that we plug them? Well, as you said, they represent a serious threat to the environment, to public health and safety. If they're not maintained, they risk losing integrity. They can lead to environmental contamination. And of course, restoring the environment after oil and gas production is done is the right thing to do. So that's the problem, but now we wrestle with the solution. The states are poised to lead the way in cooperation with the Department of Energy. We're the primary regulators of oil and gas drilling production. We know where the wells are located. We know the status of the wells. We have relationships with plugging companies and service companies and landowners, and we have the legal authority and procurement processes to undertake the efforts. We have everything we need except the budget. The economic crisis brought on by COVID-19 has led to plummeting oil and gas demand. The industry's been hit by a price war between Saudi Arabia and Russia. Thousands of workers are out of work. States that rely on taxes and fees from production for their plugging funds are very hard hit. And funding this important work will provide an immediate and meaningful stimulus to those states and their citizens. In North Dakota, we estimate that plugging and reclaiming our small number of orphan wells could sustain 600 service sector jobs for 6 months. In other words, plugging orphan wells is the proverbial nationwide shovel-ready program. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for having me here today for this discussion, and I look forward to any questions that your members may have.
Thank you, Mr. Helms. Now, Ms. Sandoval, you are recognized for 5 minutes of testimony.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I am Adrienne Sandoval, the New Mexico Energy, Minerals, and Natural Resources Department Oil Conservation Division Director. Thank you for the opportunity to speak about the environmental and economic benefits that plugging orphan wells brings to the state of New Mexico. The oil and gas industry has been a vital part of New Mexico's economy since the 1920s. The Oil Conservation Division, or OCD, is charged with regulating oil and gas production. Since 1935, the Oil and Gas Act has required that oil production take place responsibly to protect oil reserves, the rights of mineral owners, and the environment. Currently, OCD oversees more than 57,000 producing wells and over 6,000 environmental cleanup. These numbers have rapidly grown since 2015 with the historic drilling boom New Mexico and the US has seen thanks to advances in horizontal drilling. Since 2018, New Mexico has been the 3rd largest oil producer in the US. In 2019, oil and gas revenues contributed more than 45% of New Mexico's budget. However, the rapid downturn is posing new challenges for the state. From January to May of 2020, the active rig count in New Mexico dropped from 113 to 66. As of May 5th, almost 4,100 oil and gas workers filed for unemployment, with more anticipated. This results in $500 million lost wages across New Mexico and a decline of $20 million in personal income tax collection. In addition to the direct financial impacts to the state, the OCD faces additional challenges as oil prices drop. Operators face tough economic decisions that often result in reduced investment, decreased drilling and production, delayed site remediations, and even bankruptcy. With limited capital and the possibility of bankruptcy, the oil and gas operators may not be able to plug wells and reclaim facilities effectively. The Oil and Gas Act requires that orphan wells be plugged to protect reserves, mineral rights, and New Mexico's unique environment. Most wells are plugged by oil and gas operators, but when companies go bankrupt, the state steps in. The OCD has an established plugging program that facilitates an average of 50 plugged wells per year. To manage this program, the OCD hires local oil and gas service companies to perform the work, directly injecting money into the local economy. These companies are typically small companies that operators contract with to perform work at well sites. While New Mexico has some funding mechanisms in place to plug orphan wells, additional federal dollars will help us further protect the environment. Currently, New Mexico has 708 known orphan wells and approximately $2 million in financial assurance from operators to cover well plugging and site reclamation for those sites. The OCD also receives approximately $1 million a year from the Bureau of Land Management to plug wells on federal land. On average, it costs $35,000 to plug each well, equating to plugging costs exceeding $24 million for the known 708 orphan wells. However, this estimate does not include the associated site remediation costs. For orphan wells, the existing equipment must be removed, the site must be restored to its former condition. Even for a site in good condition, the remediation costs can range from $50,000 to $80,000. Sites with historic environmental issues, on the other hand, can require millions of dollars to remediate and restore. New Mexico's long history of oil and gas production makes it especially vulnerable to an increase in well abandonment. In New Mexico, there are over 57,000 active wells. Of those active wells, approximately 70% are longtime producers and considered marginal, which is defined as producing less than 60 barrels of oil per day or less than 120,000 cubic feet of gas. These wells are the most at risk in a downturn as they can quickly become uneconomic, are typically the first wells to be shut in or orphaned. So while New Mexico has 708 known orphan wells, there's the risk for many more during this downturn. Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham and Energy, Minerals, and Natural Resources Department Secretary Sarah Cottrell-Probst have made the protection of New Mexico's environment and economy a top priority. Additional funding would allow New Mexico to more rapidly plug abandoned wells and reclaim sites to minimize environmental disturbance and prevent waste of resources for future development. Supporting an increased plugging program would allow the OCD to put in place large contracts with service companies, enabling operators to hire back some of the 4,100 currently unemployed oil and gas employees and help stabilize the greater New Mexico economy while also protecting the land and the resources. Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity to share New Mexico's perspective on the positive impacts that additional federal funding, plug and reclaim well sites would bring to our state.
Thank you, Ms. Lowenthal. Now, Mr. Rainey, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Lowenthal and members of the committee. Good afternoon. It's an honor to present to you today. My name is Daniel Rainey. I'm a senior research associate at Resources for the Future and a lecturer at the Gerald Ford School of Public Policy at the University of Michigan. RFF is an independent nonprofit research institution. Our mission is to improve environmental, energy, and natural resource decisions through impartial economic research and policy engagement. The views expressed here are my own and may differ from those of other RFF experts, its officers, or its directors. To begin, workers and communities in oil and gas producing regions have been hit hard in recent months, as falling energy prices quickly translate into lost jobs, struggling businesses, and plunging tax revenue. A federal program to plug orphan oil and gas wells has the potential to support these workers and communities while also providing environmental benefits. The problem of orphan oil and gas wells is widely known, but not well quantified. The IOGCC, as has been stated, has documented more than 56,000 orphan wells in the US, but this is surely far below the true number. In Pennsylvania alone, regulators estimate that up to 560,000 orphan wells exist, but have not been documented. The EPA estimates that there are 2.1 million unplugged, abandoned oil and gas wells in the US. These wells pose several environmental risks. They can endanger above and below groundwater resources. They also release methane, a greenhouse gas that pound for pound is roughly 30 times as powerful as carbon dioxide over a 100-year time frame. The EPA currently estimates that unplugged abandoned wells emit 280,000 metric tons of methane per year, equivalent to about 9.5 million metric tons of carbon dioxide. For reference, that's about as much CO2 as all of the power plants in Massachusetts emit each year. The costs of plugging and restoring well sites vary widely. Some wells pose greater risks to groundwater, meaning that plugging operations are more complex. Some are easily accessible, while others are in hard-to-reach places or found on a steep grade. And some wells, of course, are deeper than others, requiring additional time and resources. Recent estimates provided to the IOGCC range from over $100,000 per well in Utah to less than $4,000 in Kentucky. The national average is roughly $24,000 for plugging and restoration. Using this average, the cost of plugging and restoring 56,000 wells would be roughly $1.4 billion. As with all policies, it's appropriate to consider the cost effectiveness of this approach. If we were to plug 56,000 wells at a cost of $1.4 billion and use EPA's methane estimates, and we assume that the cement plug prevents emissions for 100 years to come, we arrive at a cost of roughly $5,600 per ton of methane emissions prevented. That's equivalent to a cost of roughly $168 per ton of carbon dioxide. These abatement costs are higher than the US government's 2016 estimate for the social cost of methane and social cost of carbon, but they're similar in magnitude to some estimates published recently in the peer-reviewed literature. Turning now to jobs, I've gathered estimates of labor needs from regulators in Colorado, North Dakota, Pennsylvania, and Alberta, Canada. On average, they estimate that plugging 10 wells requires 2.4 person-years of work. If this number stays constant, plugging 56,000 wells would create roughly 13,000 jobs for 1 year. At a cost of $1.4 billion, the cost per job is just over $100,000. Before concluding, I'd like to mention two important issues related to the feasibility of implementing a program to plug this many orphaned wells. From an industry perspective, I've spoken with experts from multiple large oilfield service companies, and they are confident that industry could scale quickly to meet the demand. But there may be challenges from a state or federal regulatory perspective. For example, state programs follow standardized protocols for contracting that help prevent waste, fraud, and abuse. But those protocols could also slow the deployment of any large-scale well plugging effort. In addition, states would need to monitor and verify well plugging activities to ensure the jobs are done right. To oversee a large plugging program, they would likely need to add or reassign staff. In conclusion, a federal effort to plug orphaned and abandoned oil and gas wells has the potential to create a large number of jobs in struggling communities and reduce pollution at reasonable cost. It appears that industry could scale quickly to do this work, but there could be some challenges for state programs ramping up administrative capacity. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I look forward to our discussion that will follow.
Thank you, Mr. Rainey. And now, Ms. Kendall, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I'd like to thank you for holding this forum and for the opportunity to speak today. The Western Organization of Resource Councils, or WORC, is a network of grassroots organizations in the Northern Rockies and Great Plains. Many of our members are family farmers and ranchers, Native Americans, and other Westerners who are directly affected by oil and gas development. And it is their perspectives that I represent today. The delayed and incomplete reclamation of oil and gas wells threatens clean air and water, health, and private property rights. Our members have primarily experienced surface impacts from orphaned wells, so we'd like to emphasize that reclamation of the surface is as important as well plugging. In addition to the wells themselves, these sites often include leaking tanks and pipelines, unremediated spills, damaged fencing, noxious weeds, erosion, and other hazards that pose risks to cattle and wildlife as well as people and impede farming and ranching operations. Even before the pandemic, when states were making gradual progress to address the backlog of orphaned wells, most relied on fees on industry that are now suddenly and rapidly declining as the problem explodes. Given the very real dangers of the rapidly growing number of orphaned wells, given the unfortunate fact that states simply do not have the funds to address these wells, and given the dire need for jobs in the face of massive unemployment, we support action by Congress to deliver help to landowners, workers, communities, and states by doing a number of things. First, fully fund the plugging and reclamation of all orphaned federal and tribal wells that can be documented, including federal split estate wells that lie beneath private lands, as well as wells owned by individual tribal mineral allottees. This is a small and manageable universe compared to the numbers of orphaned wells on private lands. And these wells are subject to federal bonding and reclamation rules, so insufficient bonds can be attributed to insufficient federal rules and enforcement. Second, we support creating a fund to be allocated to states over a period of 2 to 3 years to provide an influx of funding to plug and reclaim wells on private and state lands. We also support additional funding for states and 8 federal agencies to update their orphaned well inventories as needed. As others have said, our estimate is that combined federal, state, tribal, and private orphaned well spending could create from 6,000 to 12,000 direct jobs. We urge you to consider requiring annual reports to DOI and Congress for oversight, allowing you to evaluate the program's success. And finally, we strongly urge you, as you establish this program, to take steps to ensure that this orphaned well crisis does not recur by addressing bonding reform. Even before the pandemic, the number of orphaned wells and wells at risk of being orphaned was rising. This was especially alarming because many of the wells of today will not cost an average of $24,000 to plug and reclaim. They will cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. The federal program in particular is in disarray. BLM is consistently unable to provide an accurate count of idle and orphaned wells or of the amount spent to plug and reclaim them. Federal minimum bond amounts are decades out of date and significantly lower than any state's. BLM does not even consider wells idle until they have not produced for over 7 years. This definition is established in law and is out of step with state agency practices, most of which consider wells idle after they have not produced for months or at most a year or 2. We urge you to update this definition. Finally, we urge you to create a federal orphaned well fee to provide consistent funding for the cleanup of federal and tribal wells and to expand funding for federal and tribal bond reviews and inspections and enforcement. In closing, we say yes, help landowners, workers, communities, and states by providing an infusion of funding to plug and reclaimed orphaned wells. But we also urge you to require that both federal and state agencies agree to update their programs. If we continue to rely on blanket bonds that do not even attempt to cover the cost of reclamation and orphaned well funds that can't keep up with the problems of the past, let alone make a dent in the problems of the future, we should expect to face another orphaned well crisis with billions of dollars of taxpayer liability and with thousands of Americans forced to live with leaking orphaned wells and all of the hazards associated with them. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Kendall. I want to thank all the panelists before we turn to the members for questioning for your excellent overview of the scope of the problem and the deficiencies in our orphan well and our abandonment, and also in the reclamation, in the reclaiming of the plugging of wells and the reclamation of the wells. And so now I'm going to recognize myself first and then the other members for 5 minutes of questions. My first question is, I think all the panelists talked about the need for federal involvement in dealing with orphan wells. And so my first question is to the panelists, and any of you can jump in. You know, Congress tried to set up a program before for orphan wells. It was back in the Energy Policy Act of 2005. But my understanding is it didn't work. Why not, and what can we learn from that before we set up the next policy? Any of the panelists want to jump in?
Mr. Chairman, with your permission, I will take the first shot at answering your question. IOGCC is familiar, of course, being around since 1935, is familiar with that effort in the Energy Policy Act of 2005. And the information that we have on file indicates that Congress authorized a program but never appropriated funding to assist states in plugging orphan wells. And DOE did assist us in updating idle and orphan well studies but never got money in their budget to actually pass through to states for orphan well plugging. So the only funding that ever got approved in agency budgets was just the DOE funding to help IOGCC track and publish the number of orphan wells. It's our understanding that the primary cause for the failure was a lack of appropriated funding.
Thank you. Anyone else want to jump in? That you know in your states what the federal government had tried to do before and why it failed? We've already just heard, I think from Mr. Helms, that the issue was the lack of federal funding. Any
This
other
is
thing?
Adrienne Sandoval. I would also like to add that it had a pretty extended definition of idle well, which was mentioned earlier, 7 years. We believe that is too long of a deadline for a well to be sitting idle before it can be plugged, which would really limit the definition to wells that could be that could use this funding.
Thank you. Okay, my next question is, we've talked about both the public health and the impacts of unplugged wells and the lack of reclamation. But I would like to focus on the other part of the equation, is what the opportunities are. And that, can any of you discuss the overlap that exists between the skills and the knowledge of recently laid off oil and gas industry workers and the skills and knowledge that's needed to plug and to also reclaim wells? Are there reclamation jobs that are shovel ready and good paying? And any of you can jump in and answer that.
Mr. Chairman, members, oh, go ahead, Lynn.
So North Dakota, as you're probably aware, has already begun to work on this issue with some of the CARES Act funding that we have received. We've identified 368 wells that are ready to be confiscated by the state and plugged and reclaimed. We'll be holding a hearing June 10th, so just 9 days away to kick that process off. We estimate that each plugging job will employ 15 skilled laborers, and the follow-up reclamation an additional 12 skilled laborers. And these are valuable people with CDL truck licenses, CAT operators, blade operators, welders, and specialized tool hands, cementing people. So very valuable skilled labor, highly paid, but currently either on PPP or soon to be on the unemployment rolls.
Thank you. Ms. Kendall, did you want to comment, or was it Ms. Sandoval?
Mr. Chairman, it was myself. So I'd like to also add to that, some of the service companies, which are typically defined as companies who do kind of auxiliary work and are contracted out by production companies or operators to do work on well pads. They can do well maintenance. They can work on reclamation. But these oil and gas service companies are some of the hardest hit companies right now. As production companies and operators kind of pull back and make more conservative moves right now, some of the contractors have been the first to go. And so, this oil and gas service companies, which would be have a direct benefit from this funding, are some of the hardest hit employees right now, and this would directly benefit them.
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Rainey, quickly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Briefly, I'll just say that I've spoken over the last several weeks, as I mentioned during my comments, with numerous state regulators, as well as numerous experts from the private sector, from these oil field service companies. Their collective sense is that there is the capacity that is ready to move quickly if dollars are deployed. One of the most important things that the service companies emphasize is that any rules or conditions or expectations for plugging and restoration be made clear and consistent so they could operate in a manufacturing type process as much as possible.
Thank you. I now turn to Representative Huffman for 5 minutes of questions. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This is an important discussion that you are convening, and I think with the help of our terrific panel, we're getting a better understanding of why this is a significant problem that we need to address, but also why, if we're smart about how we do it, we can achieve a whole bunch of public benefits, including the creation of jobs, and we can even make this part of our efforts to protect the environment and respond to the climate crisis. But as we do that, I am really concerned with this notion of advancing a bunch of public funding, taxpayer funding, in a way that could let bad actors get off the hook without paying for the cleanup. And so I want to ask whichever of the panelists choose to respond, in addition to bond reform, what else can we do to hold these companies accountable, or is increasing bond levels the only way?
I could speak to that briefly. So there are multiple options to raise funds to address this issue. We would need to think about it first in terms of federal lands and what the federal government might do, and then we think about what state governments might do, because they tend to operate separately in this sphere. Some states use their severance taxes or other similar mechanisms to raise funds for administrative programs that states administer. Some, if states chose to, or the federal government chose to, they could increase either royalty rates for the federal government or increase severance taxes for state governments and allocate a portion of those funds for well plugging. The downside of that approach is that it raises costs not just for the companies that are likely to abandon wells, it raises costs for all operators. So increasing bonding requirements would probably be a more targeted approach to directly address the problem rather than taking something more broad like raising royalties or increasing severance taxes.
Anyone else?
Thank you for your question. It's an excellent question. And North Dakota has been very proactive in working on bonds. I think, as you heard in the chairman's opening remarks and from others, blanket bonds are really the huge issue. And so we've been dialing back the number of inactive wells that are allowed to be on a blanket bond and limiting that and decreasing that limit every couple of years in order to lower or try to manage the number of potential orphan wells. In addition to that, we need regulatory reform in terms of how wells are transferred from one operator to another. You'll find that almost all these orphan wells ended up being transferred 3 or 4 times before the final operator went out of business and left them as an orphan well. And we need to find ways to restrict that transfer and make sure that the initial operators of the wells remain responsible for some of these costs. North Dakota does have statutes in place where we can now go back with a legal action and try to get reimbursement for any, including federal dollars, that we spend on plugging and reclaiming these orphan wells against the operators should we find any assets anywhere.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think several members of Congress just had light bulbs go off in their head about a piece of legislation that might help us address the problem of all of these transfers that end up diluting accountability. I just have one more question, and it's about when reclamation happens and they don't get it right. How common is that, and what does that mean for methane leaks and other environmental issues when these wells are identified where the reclamation hasn't worked? Who takes fixing that problem?
Representative Huffman, other members of the committee. So New Mexico, with the long history of production in the state, we've had production since the early 1900s. It does occasionally happen where a well that was plugged in the 50s, 60s, or 70s may have to be replugged. And as these issues come up, we either hold the current operator of record accountable if there is one. Otherwise, the state steps in to manage those funds. In terms of current wells right now, the state manages all of the plugging and the reclamation work. So operators have to get numerous levels of approval throughout the process so that we have a level of comfort and certainty that it has been done correctly. It's very important for us to maintain, that regulatory structure and to be involved throughout the plugging and reclamation process.
This
Thank
is
you,
Sarah
Ms.
Kendall. I would
Rainey.
add at the federal, at the federal level, this is also why we think funding for inspections and enforcement is so critically important, because I think what we've seen is that BLM lags behind the states in terms of their capacity to get out into the field and do those inspections and enforcement. And it's just, that's really the only way to ensure that proper reclamation has occurred.
Thank you. I'm going to move on. Again, wonderful questions, great answers, really illuminating our understanding of the issue. I'm going to go to next representative that I thought people who got on in the order. Representative Taurus Small was, I believe, the next person who has sat through the entire hearing. Welcome. Can you get unmute? I don't believe you're unmuted. I don't, can the others hear you? I cannot hear you. Hands up if you cannot, if you can hear. I can't hear. Can you up in the upper right-hand corner where it says mute? There may be, oh gee. Why don't we come back to you, because we're not great lip readers. We'll be back. And now we're going to move on to the next member from New Mexico, Representative Deb Holland.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Chairman. Thank you so much for this important conversation, and appreciate all of you being here and spending your time with us today. Mr. Helms and Ms. Sandoval, if the federal government provided money to states to put people back to work cleaning up orphaned wells, how quickly could that work start?
Representative Holland, members of the committee, the work could start tomorrow. New Mexico has an established plugging program. We already have some service companies on contract who are currently plugging the 50-ish wells a year that we do. We could begin ramping up those contracts immediately.
Thank you for the question, Representative Holland. And in North Dakota, it's going to take us a little bit longer to take on a program of this size and scope, but we believe by the 1st of July or shortly after the PPP program expires for these service company people, we would be able to deploy rigs and begin the plugging process.
Thank you. Thank you. Again, Mr. Helms and Ms. Sandoval, I'm hoping you can help me better understand what the fiscal impacts of orphaned and abandoned wells are on state budgets. For example, I saw recently that North Dakota is considering a proposal to use over $33 million in federal stimulus funds to plug about 550 abandoned wells in the state. Notably, about 10% of those wells were abandoned in recent weeks. I don't question that decision. As we all know, an unremediated well can pose an urgent threat to public health and safety and water supplies, and they absolutely have. However, I presume that absent the orphaned well problem, if every well was taken care of immediately at the time and expense of the gas companies, we wouldn't have this problem. But North Dakota could have used this money to address other urgent societal problems caused by the COVID crisis, especially also considering that Indian country has one of the highest rates per capita in the entire country. In light of this, I'm curious, in normal times, where does the funding to clean up orphaned and abandoned wells come from, and what kind of impacts does the funding have on the budgets for education and other state programs? That's the first part of my question. The second part is, and I can repeat these if necessary, what steps could states and federal governments take to minimize the amount of taxpayer dollars that are spent on orphaned and abandoned well cleanup? So the both of you again. Ms. Sandoval, you can go first if you'd like.
Thank you, Representative Holland, members of the committee. So currently, New Mexico's plugging program is funded by a couple different sources. First off is financial assurance from operators. For example, the 708 known orphan wells within the state, there's a little over $2 million in financial assurance available to plug those wells. In addition, for any wells on federal land, we receive and manage the BLM plugging program and receive about $1 million a year from the BLM to manage those federal wells. Lastly, New Mexico has what's called the reclamation fund. The reclamation fund comes from taxes on oil and gas operators. So where the financial assurance does not cover the costs, the reclamation fund is then utilized to plug that gap. That fund is not funded through taxpayers. That is directly coming from the oil and gas industry. However, we do expect with the downturn that the funds available will be minimized within that fund to help assist us with plugging.
Thank you for the question, Representative Holland, and I think you hit on a really important topic. So in North Dakota, similar to other states, there's a combination of fees and penalties and things like that fund our plugging fund. But it was recognized that it was not adequate at all, including the confiscation of bonds. And so a few years ago, the legislature decided to begin dedicating $7.5 to $10 million per biennium, or per year, excuse me, into the fund out of gross production taxes. Now that money, many alternative sources exist for that money. For example, typically on the tribal lands, the MHA Nation, they would get 50% of those taxes to go to tribal programs. And it could be going into K-12 education, it could be going into emergency services or local community support, but instead it's going into this plugging fund and still falling short of achieving the final purpose.
Chairman, I yield.
Thank you. I'm going to go back to Hochi. Representative Taurus Small, can you hear us now? And can you speak?
Yes, hear me.
Great.
Thank you so much, Chairman Lowenthal, for your patience and kindness and foresight in convening all of us. I really appreciated your discussion on the double whammy that's certainly being experienced in the district that I serve. And Director Sandoval, thank you for describing that in such clear ways in terms of the impacts that we're seeing on the ground. Director Sandoval, you mentioned that New Mexico's program currently doesn't have enough existing funds to quickly plug all orphaned wells. How would you design a federal program to best support New Mexico's existing orphaned wells program?
Thank you, Representative Taurus Small. That's a great question. So New Mexico recommends that the program and allocations be given directly to states. With severe accountabilities, for reporting on what the money was used for, how many sites were plugged and reclaimed. We think that this will provide the quickest injection of money into the economy. With that, I think there are a couple things and attributes of the program that would be important. I believe one of the panelists hit on it earlier, but it is important to understand that there is an administrative cost to this program that each agency or division would have to manage, along with the costs of the construction, the remediation, the plugging, et cetera. So within the OCD, for example, we have staff that manages the current plugging program. With 50 wells a year, that is something that they can do in addition to their role. It is important that if we wanted to really stimulate the economy and do a lot of plugging, that there also be an administrative grant, if you would say, as part of this, to ensure that those divisions have the appropriate staffing to manage it.
Thank you, Director Sandoval, and I think we'll get to that point a little bit later on. If I want to follow back up on the creative challenges. Quickly though, with enough funding, how many laid off oil and gas workers do you think we could put back to work in New Mexico working on plugging orphaned wells this year?
Just in the plugging and reclamation, we estimate it could be upwards of 100 oil and gas workers with high paying jobs that would support them and their families. In addition, depending on the severity of the site reclamation, that would employ quite a few more oil and gas workers. It also has, the support industries. It would be an increase in, for example, lab testing. You have to do a lot of sampling and things like that as you're remediating a site. So there would also be side benefits to other industries in New Mexico as we moved forward with plugging and reclamation.
Thank you. And with enough funding, how long would it take to plug the 708 confirmed orphan wells in New Mexico?
We estimate it, depending on the level of funding and how many crews we could have active, it could take from 1 to 3 years to plug those wells. It kind of all depends on the amount of money that's available and how many crews we could get moving right away.
I just want to pause to thank you, Chairman Lowenthal, so much for the depth of experience that we see here, from scientists and engineers to with Director Helms, some workforce experience as well. So I just really appreciate everything that we've seen here today. And I appreciated Director Helms' comments that such a project supports quick economic recovery because it is truly shovel ready. But I also recognize Mr. Rainey's note that state administrations may have trouble ramping up quickly. So in the last minute, Director Sandoval, can you speak to those challenges of helping support state administrations to ramp up quickly?
Yes. So as I mentioned, the plugging and reclamation programs do require project management, particularly as we were to ramp up the number of crews. We have to ensure that the job is being done right. And that includes, following up on the remediation throughout the process, making sure that the site is characterized properly, making sure that everything as you move through comes back clean and correct, that the plugging is done correctly. And that takes, administrative time. So we do think it is very critical that if we were to be given this funding, that there is an administrative component to assist the state government with managing these programs.
Oh, Director Rainey, go ahead.
Representative Taurus Small. Just one other point of reference on your question. I was speaking with regulators from Colorado. They provided me with some data about their administrative capacity and how it relates to well plugging. And the bottom line is that the amount of time that staff spends overseeing a typical well is almost as much as the amount of time spent by contractors actually plugging and remediating the well site. There might be variation, of course, across states, but that's just one data point to keep in mind.
Thank you, Mr. Rainey, and I yield my time.
Thank you. And finally, our last member of Congress is Representative Ben Ray Lujan. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and greetings from New Mexico. You have the entire New Mexico delegation on here, Mr. Chairman. And we always welcome you back. So as soon as we're able to travel again, we'd love to have you back, Mr. Chairman, as well as Chairman Huffman. And I know that the three of us would be honored to welcome you again. To each of our panelists today that are not from our beautiful state, I want to say thank you for your work and expertise and your testimony. I think that Director Sandoval would also open that door and make sure that we're extending a New Mexico invitation to you all to come and see the great work that she and our governor are doing, Michelle Lujan Grisham, in the state of New Mexico. So thank you so much again, Chairman, for assembling us today. And Director Sandoval, I just want to begin by thanking you and Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham for the work you're doing back in New Mexico, especially in and around the COVID crisis. The public health crisis has tested our communities in countless ways, and workers in the oil and gas industry are no exception. More must be done to assist workers across our state, and I know you'll be a continued and committed partner in supporting workers and creating new opportunities. Earlier this Congress, several of us on this video call have traveled to New Mexico to visit an oil and gas well with members of the committee, and we we're able to use a forward-looking infrared camera that allowed us to see what is typically invisible methane leaking from the site. We can smell it, but you can't always see it. This camera allowed us to see it. Methane emissions is a problem in our state, and plugging of abandoned and orphaned wells is a major opportunity to reduce methane pollution, which threatens the health and safety of New Mexicans, and also takes taxpayer money away that is rightfully owed to the people of New Mexico. Additionally, this is a great opportunity to put many people who have lost their jobs back to work, and in a way that cleans up our lands and our waters. I support this effort and appreciate all of your thoughtful considerations on this important issue. Director Sandoval, oil and gas receipts play a significant role in New Mexico's budget. And if companies shut in wells because of low prices, as has been asked already, I imagine this will make the problem of reclaiming orphan wells all the more difficult. Does the state have a plan or a way that it can make up for lost revenue that would have gone toward reclamation efforts?
Representative Lujan, members of the committee, thank you for the question. So as I described a little bit ago, the state has a couple mechanisms in order to plug wells. We have the financial assurance. We have about $1 million a year from the Bureau of Land Management, and then we have the reclamation fund. Unfortunately, as the funds in the reclamation fund dwindle, as oil and gas operators shut in their wells and less is paid into that fund, the state does not have an alternative to fund the plugging and reclamation of wells. That's why we believe that federal funding directly to the states is really critical.
And Ms. Sandoval, many
apologies.
abandoned and orphaned wells are on tribal lands. Is it important that Congress support tribes by providing funding to help plug orphaned and abandoned wells on tribal lands? And I'd ask you and Mr. Helms, quick yes or no there.
Absolutely, yes.
Mr. Helms?
Yes, and absolutely yes. 25% of our production comes from tribal lands under the MHA Nation, and they have the same orphan well problem that we do across the state.
And I appreciate Chairwoman Taurus Small asking the question to Director Sandoval about jobs in New Mexico. I'd ask you the same question, Mr. Helms. Do you have an estimate of how many jobs this would create out of North Dakota or across the country?
Yes, so we have estimated 600 high-paying jobs for 6 months can come from the funding of this program. And in addition to that, if you look nationwide, many states have more wells than North Dakota, looking at somewhere around 13,000 high-paying jobs that can be sustained for 6 months to 3 years by funding this program.
According to the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City, 40% of all U.S. oil and gas companies could go bankrupt over the next year if oil prices do not increase above $30 a barrel. This could lead to widespread well abandonments, in particular on public lands, where at last count, there were more than 96,000 oil and gas wells in operation. Director Sandoval, in your opinion, could the federal administration still take steps to protect taxpayers by reviewing and increasing bond levels for at-risk operators, similar to the process that the state of New Mexico has already started at the local level?
Representative Lujan, members of the committee, yes, I think there are actions that the federal government could take. In 2019, a GAO report recommended that BLM increase their bonds to levels that are representative of today's numbers. Those bonds have not been increased since the 50s or 60s, and they are meant to cover both plugging and reclamation. And so it would be an important step to increase the bonding on federal lands.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, thank you so much again, and I yield back.
Well, thank you. Is there any member of the panel, not the panelists, I mean members of Congress, that wants to ask any additional question before we kind of come to conclusion? If not, I don't hear. I want to say how important.
Alan, could I just ask one other,
Yep.
Mr. Chairman?
Absolutely.
One question that I have to each of the panelists, since we have the time here, is does it make more sense to establish a structured pilot program for well plugging and reclamation, and I know Director Sandoval, you answered this as well, or just send checks to states and allow them to clean up whatever sites they may want? Can you just help me understand that piece?
Yes, Representative Lujan, members of the committee, we believe that to get the most benefit for workers who are currently unemployed and for it to be direct stimulus, we would recommend that the states given funds potentially based on production levels or on marginal or stripper well numbers within the state. That would be a reasonable representation. But we believe that the funding should be given directly to the states so that we can begin to make progress immediately and begin assistance. We did recently in New Mexico speak with the Alberta Energy Minister. Canada recently did a program for well plugging, and they did give funds directly to the provinces. And from what we have heard from the Energy Minister, it has been a great success.
Representative Lujan, the Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission is currently has a cooperative agreement with the U.S. Department of Energy, and the DOE has the authority under the Energy Policy Act to administer a program like we're talking about. And we're suggesting a 3-year program through DOE and IOGCC with block grants to the states based either on the number of orphan wells they have or production. That could be worked out between Congress, DOE, and IOGCC as to what parameters they wanted in those decisions. But the capacity is there to immediately begin processing and issuing block grants to the states who already have the programs set up and the relationships with contractors to start spending the money within the next month or so.
Representative, the things I would add are that we think there are some unique issues with federal and tribal wells that require a different approach and more than just grants to the states. I think we need to allocate funding for specifically addressing all known or wells that can be documented that are federal and tribal. There are also regulatory weaknesses that we think are really important to address through whatever action Congress takes. For example, the fund that's being referred to, that fund in the Energy Policy Act of 2005 is where this 7-year definition of idle well is that's proved to be so problematic for BLM addressing the federal and tribal wells, or federal wells. It does not apply to tribal wells, I believe. And so we think that it's very important that you look at some of these issues and address the weaknesses in the regulatory programs at the same time that you're addressing the funding shortfall.
Representative Lujan, I would largely agree with the comments of my fellow panelists. Simply put, trying to stand up a federal pilot project seems like it has the potential to create some additional administrative challenges, whereas states and BLM, despite some of the drawbacks that may exist, they essentially have most of the capacity and the institutional knowledge to start to deploy these programs. And so while I would expect that it would be difficult to scale up very quickly to rapidly increase the number of wells, the experience and expertise does exist at the state level and the BLM to implement the programs once any appropriate structural changes are made.
I want to thank
Thanks,
all
Chairman.
the witnesses for the question. Yes. Just one more. Is there anyone? And I want to ask the panelists if there's any concluding remarks that you feel that we haven't asked you, we haven't said that you'd like to say. If you do, just kind of jump in. If not, before concluding this, I'd like to say this was very, very informative. When we're talking about plugging of orphan wells and the reclamation, I've learned a lot about the potentials for jobs, the importance of having bonding that really works, importance of additional federal funding, but I've also heard about as we do that, we really have to make sure that we overcome some of the regulatory weaknesses that we have, also that we build in accountability of where that money is going. Federal monies to support. We've also heard some of the impacts on tribal lands that must be addressed that we have not addressed historically. We've also heard, I think very importantly, and I'm not listing everything, that many of the oil companies that develop this, then these wells, before they become orphan wells, sell them off probably at a reduced rate to kind of bottom feeding companies who then go into bankruptcy or later on, or they sell them. And ultimately, it's very hard to find out, to get any money out of the companies that just picked up these as maybe the third or fourth owner. All of these have to be addressed in any kind of oversight as we provide additional resources. But the important thing is to work together with our sovereign nations, our tribal nations, with our states and the federal government to really deal with both a potential economic incentive. We can put people back to work and at the same time protect us from methane gases, deal with climate change, deal with issues of just abandonment of the thousands and thousands of wells that have been abandoned and not reclaimed. And so I want to thank everyone for participating. I think we've learned a lot. I think that there is really this, as we're going through this pandemic, this is a timely issue. It's timely whether we're going through the pandemic or not, but the pandemic has made it even more timely because as we look to put people back to work, this is a critical need that the nation has. And so if there's anybody else that wants to say something on the panel, if not, I'd like to say this hearing is adjourned. Bye now.